I'm the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative here at the New America Foundation. We are extremely pleased to have Gary Seymour here to talk about the current situation with Iran and the way that that's developing and the position that that might put us in. If you don't know Gary, he is one of the leading voices on non-proliferation issues. Currently, Gary is Vice President, Director of Studies, and the Maurice Greenberg Chair at the Council on Foreign Relations. But prior to that, he's been a Vice President for Global Security and Sustainability at the MacArthur Foundation. He was Director of Studies and a Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and was at the National Security Council. And I think anybody who holds any one of those four jobs has had an extremely successful career in Washington. And the fact that Gary has held all four of them suggests that he's really in quite a league of his own.
Or that I can't hold a job.
Or that he can hold a job. And, you know, you really get a sense of how far Gary goes back, and that some of the things he worked on in the early 1990s are now being declassified. And I was just teasing him about a cable, or a memo he wrote about a cable when Algeria was suspected of developing a nuclear weapons program. After the situation was resolved and the Algerians agreed to put the reactor under safeguards, he wrote a note to his boss that I think is probably the best line in this trove of documents, which is, "This should put to rest the great Algerian nuclear weapons scare," which I thought was a nice sense of humor about the entire situation. As I say, Gary's going to talk about Iran, and I'm particularly excited about that because the last time I heard him speak about Iran was when I was at the Belfer Center, and he gave what I thought was an extremely cogent presentation, both on the challenges in negotiating with Iran, but in the benefits of doing so. And I thought that it was an excellent blend of being technically conversant, politically savvy, and then having this kind of 10,000-foot big picture view that helped him keep in perspective what was important, which I think from the Algerian situation we see as a long-running trait in his personality. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Gary Seymour.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you very much for that nice introduction. I want to thank all of you for coming here to the New America Foundation. I'm going to spend just a few minutes to talk about the state of play, both in terms of the diplomacy and the technical issues, and then I'd like to allow plenty of time to listen to your comments and try to respond to your questions. Back when I was writing about the situation with Algeria, I said it was a bomb scare. I only wish that was the case with Iran. Instead, I think the situation is very stark. Iran wants a nuclear weapons capability, and the Western powers, and here I'm talking about the U.S., France, UK, are trying to stop them. This is not an issue of misunderstanding, misperception, lack of trust. This is a fundamental difference of national interest. They want a capability, we want to try to stop them. And in international politics, these kinds of clashes of fundamental differences of interest are normally solved through the balance of power and through a contest of wills. And what we've seen over the last few years since the Iranian program became public in the summer of 2002 is a gradual shift in the balance of power against us and in their favor. In the immediate aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in early 2003, Tehran was very concerned about referral to the Security Council, about the possibility that the U.S. would press on and attack them next. And as a consequence, the Iranians were willing to accept a suspension on some key elements of their enrichment program during their negotiations with the EU3, the UK, France, and Germany. But after the election of President Ahmadinejad in the summer of 2005, the Iranians calculated that they were in a much stronger position, mainly because of the U.S. mess in Iraq, which in their view weakened the United States and reduced the risk that the U.S. would attack them, but also because Tehran calculated that the kind of sanctions the Security Council would dish out were likely to be something they could manage. And so they proceeded to unsuspend their enrichment program. And they've been working at trying to perfect the technology and build up their capability ever since then. Now, in response to this Iranian decision that they were strong enough to move ahead with their nuclear weapons efforts, the Western powers, and again I'm talking about the U.S., France, Germany, and the U.K., came up with a dual strategy. They would try to use political and economic sanctions through the UN Security Council to pressure Iran to accept once again, accept a suspension of their enrichment program as a condition for starting international negotiations, which would include the United States. And the calculation at the time is that within Tehran there was a debate about how to manage the nuclear issue, and that to put it in very simplistic terms, President Ahmadinejad and the people around him advocated a much more confrontational approach of proceeding as quickly as possible, despite the potential economic damages and the loss of opportunity to improve relations with outside countries like the United States, whereas other figures in Iran, normally people identified with Rafsanjani, were prepared to accept some limits or delays in the nuclear program in order to avoid an international crisis and to create an opening for better relations with the United States. In fact, Rafsanjani had run for president on a platform of building better relations with Washington. Now, the good news is that this dual strategy of offering sanctions, of pressure with sanctions on one hand, offering negotiations on the other, it was very successful in building an international consensus. And in particular, the Russians and the Chinese signed on board to this approach. So you got a series of UN Security Council statements and then 2 mild sanctions resolutions, which on one hand demanded that Iran suspend their enrichment program, on the other hand offered to suspend these sanctions if Iran would suspend its enrichment program and begin international talks. So the good news is that this approach got a strong international support. The bad news is that it hasn't worked. And this reminds me of the old joke about the doctor who says after the operation that the operation was a complete success. Unfortunately, the patient died. Now, we've seen some evidence of shifts in the balance of power inside Tehran, with Rafsanjani improving his position slightly against Ahmadinejad. But in terms of the Iranian nuclear program, Tehran still appears to be confident that it can press ahead with its enrichment program with relative impunity. Wednesday night, I had a chance to meet with the president of Iran, me and a number of other people, and I said to him that I thought the risk of war was increasing because of Iraq and because of the stalemate over the nuclear issue. And his response was, no, I don't agree with your analysis. I don't think the United States will attack us. And I think this reflects, as far as I can tell, continuing confidence on the part of the Iranians that they can move ahead with their nuclear program with relatively low risk of either suffering a military attack or the kind of punishing economic sanctions that might create instability. And in order to help strengthen their position, the latest Iranian gambit has been to reach agreement with the IAEA in August on a plan to resolve a number of outstanding questions about Iran's past nuclear activities, including concerns by the IAEA that involve advanced centrifuge research or nuclear weapons research. And in this plan, which you can read, it's a short 3-page plan that's on the IAEA website if you want to see the details, but it's a phased approach where these different outstanding questions would be tackled one at a time with a target date of ending, with a target date of resolving all these issues by the end of November. Now, Iran has made clear that it will suspend its actions under this IAEA agreement if the Security Council passes any further sanctions resolutions. And so the Russians and the Chinese have both said, let's delay any further action in New York until we see whether the Iranians are really sincere about resolving these questions about their past nuclear activities. And the U.S. and France and the U.K. have been forced to go along, both because obviously it would be desirable in substance if these issues were resolved, but also because they want to maintain the unity and they don't want to risk a veto by the Russians and Chinese on another sanctions resolution. Now, so I think the next couple of months, nothing will happen in New York. I mean, all eyes will be on this deal between the IAEA and the Iranians to see whether Iran actually provides new evidence to respond to questions and concerns that the IAEA has about previously undeclared activities. Now, if the Iranians actually cooperate with the IAEA and they satisfy the agency's concerns by providing additional information, and the IAEA says it's satisfied and gives Iran a clean bill of health, then I think our ability to maintain support at the UN for a suspension of the enrichment program will be very seriously undercut. The Russian position has always been that Iran should suspend its enrichment program while there are doubts about its program. But once those doubts are resolved, and that's the job of the IAEA, then Iran has a right to proceed with a civil enrichment program just like any other NPT party in good standing. So if Iran actually comes clean, or if the IAEA says that Iran has actually come clean, then I think our diplomatic strategy will be very, very seriously weakened. On the other hand, the betting in Washington and London and Paris is that the Iranians cannot afford to truly reveal the secret activities that they're engaged in. And this is based on a belief that both in the past and probably right now, they're carrying out clandestine work on nuclear weapons and on advanced centrifuges. So the Western bet is that Iran won't be able to carry out this agreement. The IAEA won't be able to say that Iran has satisfied their concerns. And once that happens, the U.S. and the U.K. and France will be in a stronger position to go back to the Russians and Chinese, probably at the end of this year or early next year, and argue in favor of yet a third sanctions resolution that will tighten the screws a little bit more. In the meantime, we'll try to squeeze Iran through these coalition of the willing sanctions, which are good, but I'm afraid it's going to be very hard to mount a serious sanctions campaign that doesn't have the blessing of the UN Security Council, because a number of the key European countries, like Germany and Italy and so forth, argue that these kinds of coalition of the willing sanctions are useless if the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians are prepared to step in and replace whatever bank loans and whatever contracts German industry gives up. So in order for us to have a really effective sanctions regime, I think it really has to be something that is promulgated by the UN Security Council. Now, I still think there's a chance that this kind of sanctions approach, stepping up the sanctions, will succeed in convincing Tehran to accept a temporary suspension of their enrichment program in exchange for a suspension of the sanctions while the talks are going on. And in that case, we'll get into these international negotiations, and an effort will be made to try to come up with some agreement to limit or to delay Iran's enrichment program in exchange for security assurances, assistance to their civil nuclear program, lifting economic sanctions, and so forth. I think the odds for an agreement are actually very low because, as I said, there's a fundamental Iranian desire to acquire a nuclear weapons capability, and I'm not sure they're prepared to give that up under current circumstances. But nonetheless, if you had a suspension in place during these negotiations, that would buy some time. For that reason, I think it would be a mistake for the U.S. to lift the condition of suspension as a basis for beginning the talks. If we talk to the Iranians, if we negotiate with the Iranians about their nuclear program at the same time that they're continuing to work on their enrichment program, I think we put ourselves in such a hopeless bargaining position that the chances of the negotiations succeeding are even worse. And this is a mistake the Bush administration made with the North Koreans after the collapse of the agreed framework. We had a situation where we were trying to convince them to limit or give up their nuclear weapons while they were producing plutonium as fast as they could. And that kind of a situation is one where you just really can't expect to come out very successfully. Now, fortunately, I think, I'm trying to end with some good news. Fortunately, I think we still have time to play out this diplomatic hand because the Iranians still appear to be having technical problems operating their centrifuge machines at high capacity. Now, there's some disagreement or question about exactly how serious these questions are, about how serious these problems are, but there's no doubt that that as recorded by the IAEA, they're running them at very low capacity. 5 or 10% of what they should be able to produce if they were running at high speeds or if they were running continuously. And then, of course, even after Iran solves these technical problems, they'll still have to install sufficient enrichment capacity so that they could move ahead quickly with a political decision to produce sufficient weapons-grade uranium for even a single bomb. And from this standpoint, a pilot-scale facility of about 3,000 centrifuges, which is the current Iranian plan, they'll probably have 3,000 machines installed by the end of this year, but as I say, if they're not running properly, they can't do much. But even if they're running properly, it would take a year or even more of continuous operation to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a single bomb. And that's not a very good breakout capability, because that would be detected by the IAEA that they were producing highly enriched uranium, and there would be an entire year where the world or the United States or Israel would be able to take military action before the Iranians would have enough fissile material on hand for a nuclear weapon. I think it's much more likely that the Iranians will continue to honor their safeguards agreement until they've built up a really big enrichment capacity, like an industrial scale facility of about 50,000 centrifuge machines. Once they have that in place, then they can break out really quickly in a week or even a few days. And also having a big infrastructure, a big overt infrastructure safeguarded by the IAEA creates many more opportunities for a parallel clandestine program than having one little pilot plant. So my sort of scenario for, I think the most likely strategy for the Iranian program is to wait until they've really built up a much bigger civil enrichment program before making a political decision, which may not have been made yet, about whether or not to actually produce nuclear weapons. What the Iranians say to you in private, and I've spoken to many Iranian experts and officials, they say that, look, we live in a very dangerous neighborhood. We're surrounded by countries with nuclear weapons, Israel, Russia, the United States, India, Pakistan. We have to have a capability. We have to have the option. But trust us, we'll keep it latent. We won't actually build nuclear weapons because we know that that would upset the neighbors and make us a target of military action. So it may be that they haven't made a decision yet. I think once they have the capability in place, I think the temptation to produce nuclear weapons will be overwhelming. But this may not be a pattern where we see Iran take high risks in the near term to produce nuclear weapons. They may feel they have strategic patience to put in place a large installed capacity and make a decision later on down the road whether to actually produce nuclear weapons. So I think the challenge for us is that if this diplomatic stalemate continues, and if Iran does begin to overcome the technical hurdles, I think we will eventually face the stark choice that the French President Sarkozy has summarized as either to bomb Iran or to face an Iranian bomb. Yes, I believe he did, actually. Bomb Iran. Well, anyway, if he didn't say it, I'll say it. Bomb Iran or an Iranian bomb. Thank you all very much, and I'm happy to listen to your comments and answer any questions. Thank you.
Well,
I should stand up just.
okay, great. Well, I guess I'll stand with you. And
you sit down.
I need to.
Okay.
Please.
Just because I can see better.
Indeed. Well, do you want to pick whose question you take? Okay. We'll take a few questions from the floor. I'd ask that people identify themselves, but I'm going to start with the first question, which is, Gary, you said that that there's a risk that the diplomatic game is going to play itself out, and that we'll be faced with this choice. I mean, are there things that we do while the diplomatic side is playing out that lay the groundwork for whatever choice we make if the diplomacy fails, whether it's bombing Iran or coming up with some kind of containment strategy? And if so, what are those things we do?
Well, that's a very good question. On the military side, I'm sure that, a great deal of planning is is being carried out, so that if the White House felt it was necessary to take military action, at least those plans would be in place. And, I think it's important for us to recognize that this, may very well not come to a head during the Bush administration. It may very well be that because of technical delays or because the Iranians make a tactical decision to accept a temporary suspension in order to reduce the risk of an attack in the last year of the Bush administration, this issue may very well fall into the lap of the next administration. And so this stark choice we face may not actually happen in the next year or two. It may be 5 years down the road. It really depends. On the containment side, I think there are several elements of that. The first element is trying to contain Iran as a dominant regional power, which is one of the main reasons why the Iranians see nuclear weapons as an important national asset. Now, we're already doing that. I mean, our whole policy in the Middle East is designed to contain Iran. And so, as you all know, we're trying to develop a Sunni Arab alliance. We're trying to push the peace process in order to take away one of Iran's tools. We're building alliances with Sunni tribes in Iraq in order to, balance against Iran's allies in Iraq. So, and we're trying to strengthen our security relationship with Saudi Arabia and the small Gulf states through arms sales and so forth. So we're already engaged in a containment strategy. And whether or not, whatever happens with the nuclear issue, we'll continue to do that because the U.S. and Iran have fundamentally different interests in the Persian Gulf, which is basically we want to be the dominant power versus they want to be the dominant power, and there can only be one dominant power. The other thing I think is very important is that if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, there, I think, will be tremendous political pressure on some of Iran's neighbors to develop nuclear weapons on their own. Now, fortunately, none of those countries have an advanced technical capability, and all of them would be starting from a very low level of technical expertise, with very few nuclear infrastructure and not too many trained personnel. But I think it's important for us to start thinking ahead to the possibility that other countries in the region might begin to develop a hedging strategy. And of course, we've all noticed that a number of countries in the region have expressed a newfound interest in nuclear power, which is partly political signaling, but partly, I think, sort of paving the way if they feel they need to begin to pursue a nuclear program. And, who knows what happened in Syria, but, depending upon the nature of the target, that might be the first indication of the risk that nuclear proliferation could spread to other countries in the Middle East.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. David?
David Eisenberg, British American Security Information Council. Sir, on August 30th, when the Director General of the IAEA released his report outlining the modalities for settling Iran nuclear issue, ever since then, Iran has said, case settled, no more debate. All questions are answered. But I noticed one of the provisions in that report in particular said that Iran would have to settle all the outstanding questions regarding the P-122 centrifuges.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, most people seem to think that in order to do that, Pakistan would have to make available AQ-Khan for further questions, something that they've not done to date. And yesterday, Benazir Bhutto briefly floated the idea in a talk, and if you read the news today, Pakistan has said there's no way we'll ever do that. So that would seem to indicate, that you'll never really have resolution of that issue. And if we believe the IAEA report, don't have resolution of that issue, then you can't really have resolution of the whole program. So how much of a sticking point will that be in the future?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I think the technical people at the IAEA have indicated to me that they think it's very likely that Iran carried out and may still be carrying out research on P2 that they've not fully declared. And the story the Iranians have given to the IAEA is not very convincing. And of course, there's some evidence that the program is much larger than the Iranians have claimed, such as efforts to buy large numbers of magnets and so forth that are designed for use in P2s. Now, I think in theory, the Iranians, if they really wanted to make a clean breast of it, they could. They could really open up their files, they could make scientists available, and they really could convince the IAEA that well, yes, before they didn't quite have all the facts, and now they're presenting a full set of facts, and the people who hid these materials have been appropriately punished. I mean, I think it's possible for the Iranians, if they made a political decision, to clear up the P2 matter without, obviously it would be helpful to have A.Q. Khan's testimony, but I think it could be done without it. And I said in my speech, the question, which we won't know the answer to for a couple of months now, is whether the Iranians are prepared to go down that road of truly, revealing secret activities in order to get a clean bill of health from the IAEA, or whether they really are not prepared yet to provide that information, and this agreement with the IAEA will collapse.
I'll just raise my voice. Robert Schroeder with International Investor. We've seen recently that Israel is not as patient as some might suggest the United States and others could be. You seem to suggest that there's a more relaxed timeline here. If Israel feels that Iran is getting very close to the production of nuclear capability, don't you believe there's a greater risk that they might take their own unilateral military action?
Well,
Just
sure, of course.
quickly summarize, because people in the back are saying they can.
Summarize the question.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
And no, that's my fault. We'll pass this around.
I was asked about whether Israel had a shorter hair trigger than the United States. And I think the answer is yes. I think that of all the countries in the world, Israel feels, much more directly threatened by Iran developing nuclear weapons than, anyone else. I mean, for them, and I think the Israelis do genuinely believe it's an existential threat.
So very hard to judge the timeline going forward that something could happen.
Well, this is what I hear from the Israelis. From Israeli officials. On one hand, they recognize the limitations and risks of the use of military force. They recognize that that's not a very attractive option for a variety of reasons that we can discuss, and questions about how effective it will be, and questions about what the consequences would be in terms of broader conflict. So the Israelis would certainly like to see a diplomatic solution. That is to say, they'd like to see Iran suspend its enrichment program. And the Israelis, I think, are very focused on how to design a sanctions package that would have the effect of persuading Tehran to accept a temporary suspension. And when I talk to the Israelis, they still express some optimism that this can be achieved. On the other hand, I have been told many times that Israelis think, 2008 is the year of living dangerously. That if the Iranians, begin to overcome their technical hurdles and achieve some important technical benchmarks, that Israel will be faced with a very serious threat. And in terms of the politics, I think the Israelis believe that President Bush would be very sympathetic to a decision on their part to attack Iran, and so Israel might decide that it's better to attack in 2008 while President Bush is still in office, rather than run the risk that the next president might not be as sympathetic. But just one footnote, the question of whether or not Israel has the military capacity to effectively attack Iran, I think, is very much open to question. Some Israelis have said to me they're very confident they can do the job. Others have said that, well, we really would be hard-pressed because of the distances involved and the nature of the facilities and the number of facilities. I don't think anybody questions that the U.S. has considerably more raw military power to destroy the known facilities, and that for Israel it would be a stretch. So I think from Israel's standpoint, the most attractive military option is a U.S. military option.
Howard, former State Department.
Well, I was going to get the guy behind you, but I'm going to do you both in order, so.
Okay, I'm going to go first.
Okay. All right.
Al Richmond, former State Department. Since the Soviet and Chinese policy is so critical to whether sanctions work, I wondered, would you give me your view of what their motives are, whether they will actually come across to support sanctions prior to Iran's acquiring of nuclear weapons, which does not seem to be in their interest?
Well, I'll do my best to answer based on officials that I've spoken to in Moscow and in Beijing. First of all, both the Russians and Chinese have absolutely no doubt that Iran is seeking a nuclear weapons capability. They don't question that at all. They both think that would be very undesirable It would not be in their interests, and I think that's part of the reason why they've joined the Western strategy. On the other hand, I do detect in Russia, on one hand, a certain resignation, a certain feeling that at the end of the day this probably can't be prevented, and the nature of the threat to Russian interests is much less than the threat as perceived from Washington or from Tel Aviv or even from Paris and London. So I think there's a certain kind of sense in Moscow that, we can live with this, and why should we destroy our bilateral relations with Tehran over an issue that really, can't be prevented. Interestingly, in Beijing, I've met many people who have said, we think the U.S. will bomb Iran. And there's a feeling that, if the U.S. is going to bomb Iran and take care of this problem, why should we sacrifice our economic interests over a problem that, is going to be taken care of in some other way? But if I could just add, the Russians really are the key. I mean, the Chinese have very deliberately decided not to be out front on this issue. And they will I think they'll follow the Russians. If the Russians block consensus, the Chinese will support the Russians. If the Russians join the P3 in supporting a sanctions resolution, the Chinese will join. So this really is a Moscow issue. And unfortunately, our relations, and when I say I mean the West's relations with Moscow are pretty bad right now.
Yeah, put your hand up. Thanks.
Chris Schaefer, CNO Resources. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. I want to pursue a little bit further this question of political urgency. In particular, if you could speak to the Iranian president's recent remarks, and I'm curious if got a lot of media play in the U.S. on network television, that sort of thing. So a lot of Americans are probably outside of the Washington circles are really tuned into this. And Congress, if you could speak to sort of Congress, the American people selling this, the sense of urgency, where you place that in the equation.
Well, I think the White House is very deliberately trying to downplay the urgency. I mean, President Bush didn't even mention Iran in his speech. And, U.S. government officials emphasize that there is time, that because of the technical difficulties Iran is facing, there's an opportunity to play out this diplomatic hand. And I think that's because the military option is very unattractive. And the White House is hoping that it's not faced with that stark choice. They're hoping diplomacy works, or that technical problems will impede Iran's program and make it possible for this administration to end without Iran having crossed some magical red line. I should say, just as a footnote, it's very hard to define what the red line is. And I think that's one of the difficulties that everybody will face in terms of trying to make a decision whether or not to acquiesce or to bomb. Because, as I said, if they have a 3,000 pilot scale plant operating properly, they're still a year away from having enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. Now, if you sit in Tel Aviv, that might be, crossed a red line. If you sit in Washington, it may not be crossed a red line. I mean, I think the sort of tolerance for threat and risk varies tremendously between Israel, Washington, Europe, Russia, and China, and I think that could lead to some really significant weaknesses in the international coalition.
All the way in the back.
I guess that's me. Jeff Aaron, Federation of American Scientists. Hi, Gary.
Hi.
Two questions. Are there any carrots for Iran? Is there anything that they want besides regional power? And the second question is the impact of the U.S.-India treaty, in which India doesn't seem to be changing its relationship with Iran. But it does undermine the NPT. And what does it say to non-nuclear powers?
Well, on the first, as I said, if we ever got into a serious negotiation to try to persuade Iran to delay or limit their enrichment program, we would obviously have to table serious carrots. And I mentioned a few, could include security assurances, lifting economic sanctions, trying to create some kind of mechanism in the Persian Gulf to recognize their importance, help for their civil nuclear power program, short of the fuel cycle. I mean, everybody knows what the carrots are. The problem is that Iran's not interested in those carrots right now. Iran's interested in the nuclear weapons capacity. And until we convince them that the risks of pursuing that nuclear weapons capacity outweigh the potential benefits, I think all the carrots in the world are useless. That's what I'm saying. The weakness in our position is not that we're not offering them things that are good enough. The weakness in our position is that we're not threatening them with things that are bad enough.
I wanted to follow up on that. You mentioned you've been very careful to say Iran seeks a nuclear weapons capability, and at one point you mentioned that the actual decision to build a bomb has not necessarily been made. So, when you look at the issue of how much time we have and you look at our strategy, how do you factor Iranian domestic politics into that? I mean, is that something that we have to treat as a black box and can't be concerned with, or are there real prospects there to use a delaying strategy to maybe wait for a different coalition to make decisions about Iran's security?
I think we can't predict what will happen in Iranian politics, and I certainly think it would be foolish to predict that there'll be some fundamental change in the regime that would bring to power, liberal reformists. But at the same time, I think faced with this situation where we have limited options and limited leverage, I think delay is always good, because something may happen that will, improve the chances that the government in Tehran will decide that they're willing to live with a capacity that's less than a strong breakout capability. I mean, it seems to me any diplomatic solution is probably going to have to accept that Iran will have some kind of limited enrichment capacity, under very heavily safeguarded conditions and so forth. I think at this point, it probably is unlikely that they would be willing to settle for nothing. But as I said in my talks, there's a huge technical difference between a research and development level capacity and industrial scale capacity in terms of the breakout risk. But again, the mood in Tehran is not to accept anything less than a full breakout capacity, and we're going to have to change the balance of power before they would be willing, I think, to accept something much more limited. Jeffrey, I'm sorry, what was the other question you asked?
U.S.-India.
Oh, yeah, U.S.-India. Well, I mean, it's given the Iranians another talking point. I mean, they're very clever diplomats, and so they, and the North Koreans for that matter, are going around saying, we want to be treated just like India. But, I don't think, outside of the halls of the UN and the Conference on Disarmament, I don't think it actually matters very much. I've heard, the Iranians have said for a long time, I've heard them say for many years that, the U.S. has a double standard, and if we had good relations with the United States, like Israel or India or even Pakistan, Washington wouldn't mind so much about us having a nuclear weapons capability. So I suppose you could say the U.S.-India deal has reinforced their sense that U.S. nonproliferation policy is simply a tool, like our human rights policy, used against our enemies rather than something we really believe in. But I think they already believe that, so it's going to be hard, I think, to measure much difference.
Yeah, with the blue suit gentleman I met earlier.
Hi, Gordon.
Gordon, thank you.
Thanks. Gordon Epstein with Mitsubishi Corporation. Gary, in your conversations with foreign officials, do any of them express or entertain the hope that a really tight, biting economic sanctions regime, might have some usefulness in deterring Iran from proceeding with its nuclear ambitions, or is that, pretty much dismissed? And secondly, unrelated question, I saw that General Abizade spoke at CSIS last week, and he said words to the effect that, maybe we'll just have to learn to live with it. He sounded like Chirac did a year ago. Mm-hmm. Any comment on that?
Well, those are both very good questions. On the first, as I suggested, there was a very sophisticated theory developed by the British, French, and Germans that given the power struggle within the ruling elite in Tehran between the hardliners and the pragmatic conservatives, you could alter the arguments in that power struggle through symbolic sanctions and through symbolic political isolation. And you could strengthen the hand of the pragmatic conservatives who would argue to the supreme leader that Ahmadinejad's crazy policies of denying the Holocaust and talking about Israel being wiped off the earth and simply ignoring UN Security Council, that is getting us into a dangerous situation, and it would be much smarter for us to do this in a much more sophisticated way. not that we don't want to ultimately achieve a nuclear weapons capability. There's no disagreement on the objective, but tactically we'll do it in a way that doesn't, stick a finger in everybody's eye. That was the theory, and it was based on, British, French, German reading of Iranian domestic politics, and they have their diplomats there in Tehran, so they have some standing to make these kinds of judgments. That's turned out to be wrong. That symbolic sanctions have not done the job. And so the question, and we don't know the answer to, the question is whether much more significant sanctions could do the job. We don't know the answer to that, but as I said, the alternative, to me, the alternative is bombing or acquiescence, both of which are terrible options. So at this point, I don't see any choice but for us to actually play out the sanctions hand and see if it might make a difference. On your second question, I thought a lot about this. And let me say this. I think that if Iran had nuclear weapons, and let's just stipulate for the sake of argument that we're not talking about capability, we're talking about they go all the way and they build a stockpile of nuclear weapons. I think the deterrence would operate because I don't think the Iranians are suicidal. I don't think they would, deliberately want to provoke a nuclear war because they know what the retaliation would be. But at the same time, as we know from the Cold War, once, enemies have nuclear weapons, you run the danger of miscalculation, escalation. For example, imagine if, Iran had nuclear weapons and there's another war in southern Lebanon, and the Iranians say to the Israelis, leave our Hezbollah friends alone, and the Israelis see the Iranians begin to mobilize their nuclear-armed missiles. So the Israelis may think, we're not going to wait for those missiles to be armed, we're going to destroy them. And if the Israelis started to carry out that kind of an attack, the Iranians might think, well, we better use our nuclear weapons now before they're all gone. I mean, it's the Cuban Missile Crisis thing. I think that's a real danger. So, I don't worry about the Iranians. So there's kind of a crazy theory that, Iran will start a nuclear war in order to hasten the second coming of the Mahdi. I think that's nutty. But I do think there is a serious danger of escalation, miscalculation, even leakage, loss of control, and who knows what kind of command and control system the Iranians will develop, what kinds of security procedures for nuclear weapons and fissile material. I mean, so far, no nuclear armed power has lost control over their nuclear weapons that we know of. I mean, there's been no accidental or unauthorized launch. But, if Iran doesn't have any nuclear weapons, the risk of that happening is zero. If they have nuclear weapons, there's some non-zero, probably very low probability that it could happen.
John Fox with Global Security Newswire. Assuming the choice is between acquiescence or bombing, not an invasion and regime change, I'm curious what your sense is of U.S. intelligence. Do we know where these sites are? Would we be able to destroy them all? And second, if we were to bomb, what does that really gain us? Is this just kicking the can down the road 6 months, 12 months? I mean, you can't make them unlearn this if they reach these technical benchmarks.
Well, I think you've really identified the primary question that will go into a decision about a military attack, which is how effective will it be? And I think it's very difficult to make that judgment. It's very difficult for me to make the judgment because I'm not reading the classified information. But let me start with the premise that I think most people believe that we could destroy the known facilities. That is to say, Isfahan, Natanz, Bushehr, so forth, the heavy water plant up in Iraq. Those could be destroyed. So then the question is, A, to what extent have the Iranians taken precautions to stockpile materials and equipment in order to rebuild after an attack? You have to assume they've done that. And of course, since the end of inspections by the IAEA under the additional protocol in January of 2006, the IAEA has no eyes on the production facilities. So the Iranians are producing centrifuge parts for the last 2 years. I don't know where they are. They could be, stuck in a cave someplace so that they could rebuild in the aftermath. I mean, we know that's what they've done with their UF-6. They put their UF-6 in tunnels in order to protect it from a military attack. So that's the first issue, is that the Iranians have presumably taken some precautions so they can rebuild after an attack. Second, there's the question of clandestine facilities. Now, as I said earlier, I think there's a very common assumption in the U.S. and in all Western intelligence intelligence agencies that Iran is carrying out some clandestine research on nuclear weapons and probably centrifuges. But there's an uncertainty about whether they might be building clandestine production facilities. I think they probably haven't, but still that's something you need to take into consideration. So with all of those uncertainties, there's a real question of whether or not, you could buy 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. And again, I think the value of the time you buy depends very much on your perception of the threat and your tolerance for risk. If you said to an Israeli, you buy 2 years, they'd say, great. If you said to an American, you buy 2 years, the answer might be, well, gee, is that really worth all the risks I'm going to be running?
I wanted to follow up on that because I had a discussion with a former Israeli official where I put that question to him. I said, well, okay, so if you buy 2 or 3 years, what are you going to do with the 2 or 3 years? I mean, do you have a strategy? And he said, well, we could just hit them again. And I mean, I found that to be a less than satisfying answer. And so, my question is, does it make any sense to conduct a military strike if you don't have some plan for what you're going to do with that time, while presumably people are sufficiently motivated to go out and actually build one? And if you do think that that's an important thing, then what elements of that strategy would you include?
Yeah. Well, that's the other big uncertainty that goes into the decision for using military force. Is we don't know what the Iranian reaction will be. Not only in the nuclear area, would they leave the NPT or not? I mean, I have always assumed they would leave the NPT so they could rebuild without hindrance from international inspectors and therefore reduce the risk of being attacked again. But, what Iranian officials tell me is no, we wouldn't leave the NPT. I don't think they'd make that decision until after they're attacked, but that would be an important consideration, whether they leave the NPT or not, because that would affect the likelihood that we would be able to locate, and attack additional facilities somewhere down the road. I think it would also depend on the overall relationship. I mean, and again, you can argue it either way. You can argue that if Iran was attacked, it would, have a chastening effect, and that those officials who are arguing that Ahmadinejad is running unnecessary risks with this confrontational approach, they would have a very strong hand, and they would be able to argue that it makes much more sense for Iran to eventually, and they couldn't do it right away, to eventually seek an accommodation with the United States in order to avoid, a military strike. Because, after all, Iran does not want to get into a war with the United States. Iran understands their relative, weakness vis-a-vis the U.S. from a military standpoint. You can also argue that it would, so fire up nationalism and hatred of the United States that that we would have no opportunity whatsoever for any political accommodation. And I don't think we can make that judgment. I don't think we know what the consequences of an attack would be.
Behind John. Yeah.
C.M. Brown, I'm from the Tower Center in Dallas, Texas.
Do you want to use the... yeah.
C.M. Brown, I'm from the Tower Center in Dallas, Texas. Given the uncertainties and the risks of military action, is it wise to dichotomize the choices, as the tendency is to do, between it's okay and it's intolerable? Because that can box the next administration into having to respond with military force, rather than at the time assessing the very uncomfortable risks of acceptance, not willing acceptance, but of living in a very dangerous situation with a nuclear-armed Iran versus taking them out. It appears to me that a diplomatic strategy that accepts the proposition and articulates the proposition that Iran's possession of nuclear weapons is intolerable limits the options of a future administration.
Well, I completely agree with you, but every American politician is on record as saying that Iran having nuclear weapons is unacceptable, as is the French president and many others. So I think we've already committed ourselves to a position on that issue. Now, that doesn't mean that we would necessarily use military force, because after all, I remember the days when we said, North Korea having nuclear weapons was unacceptable. Well, guess what? They have nuclear weapons and we're living with it.
Well, can I just say that yes, of course, the politicians are saying this, but in the think tank dialogue, and when we're talking about it seriously, it appears to me we ought not to be reinforcing that dichotomous choice.
I didn't say it was unacceptable. I said it was extremely undesirable.
Yeah, I know you are. Right?
I mean, look, this is a very important point. Even if we use military force, it doesn't stop Iran from seeking to develop nuclear weapons. It may just delay. And so, I think from that standpoint, even if we use military force, we may eventually have to figure out how to contain and manage and deter a nuclear-armed Iran. If they really want nuclear weapons, given the resources and size and capabilities of that country, the only way to stop them for sure is to invade and occupy the country. And we're not capable of doing that.
Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report, and I want to come at this question of potential for conflict between Iran and the U.S. from a different perspective. The Bill of Particulars on Iran, the sort of grand bargain is the basic elements have been there for a long time: support for terrorism, nuclear weapons, human rights abuses, etc. But we have this newer factor, which is the alleged involvement of the Revolutionary Guard in the training and perhaps more than that of insurgents in Iraq. A. B. I think we know, that's sort of the royal we, that there are plans that have been developed by the Pentagon that focus on Iran pretty much in response to the sort of nuclear-related threat. My question is, and I don't know whether this is sort of off agenda for you or not, but let me frame it anyway. What do you think the likelihood is that if there is increasing evidence that the Revolutionary Guard is involved and is involved directly, and American soldiers are dying as a result of it, that the 44th president, if not the 43rd, is going to be forced to take some action in Iran vis-a-vis that versus the Revolutionary Guard? And what does that do to the overall sort of equation vis-a-vis these two countries?
That's a very good question. I think the risk of a military clash in the near future is much more likely over Iraq than over the nuclear question. Because, as I said, over the nuclear question, there appears to be some time before a decision would have to be made. But I think U.S. officials, genuinely believe that Iran is providing lethal assistance, to some of the Shia militia groups who are then using it to kill American soldiers. And my understanding, and I've heard this from very senior Iraqi officials as well, is that the Iranians are escalating that assistance and providing new types of lethal weapons to the militia. And I think this is in part a response to what the Iranians see as the U.S. strategy of supporting the Sunni tribes and in order to balance the Shia groups in Baghdad. Now, I could easily imagine, if the U.S. was aware of some warehouse or some trucks, across the border that was, getting ready to, transit, over into Iraq, that we could use special forces or, even aircraft, to bomb those targets. You could imagine an incident at sea. I mean, if the Revolutionary Guard Navy tries to capture, some more British sailors, I could easily imagine a situation where we feel we have to sink, part of the Navy or even destroy port facilities. So I think the near-term flashpoint, and this could happen, not through some very careful calculation, but through a spontaneous, clash along the border, a hot pursuit raid or something like that. I think that's a much more likely near-term. Now, you ask the question, what will the consequences be? Again, I think you can argue it either way. You could argue that if this kind of thing happened, it might strengthen those in Tehran who would argue that the situation is getting very dangerous and that Tehran might want to, for tactical reasons, take a pause in their activities. In fact, one argument, this is an optimistic argument, but one argument is that once the Iranians have 3,000 centrifuge machines running properly, once they have their pilot scale plant finished, they then might decide to accept the UN Security Council demands so they can begin these talks with the U.S. and other countries. And the purpose of that would be to at least buy time through the rest of the Bush administration. And then they would hope that the next administration would be much less hostile and much less willing to take military force. And that's optimistic. We'll see if that actually happens.
I wanted to follow up on that because I'm a little disappointed that we haven't had a sort of regionalist-oriented question, and so I'll ask it myself. I mean, which is, can we really solve this particular problem, the nuclear issue, in isolation? I mean, we were talking about the North Korea agreement,
Right.
and I mean, the sort of deal is, you know, they shut down the reactor and we take them off the sponsors of terrorism list. Well, ain't no getting Iran off the sponsors of terrorism list without a whole bunch of other changes in their behavior. And so, I mean, how does one, I mean, if you start talking about putting these benefits on the table, particularly the security guarantees, can you really do that in isolation without resolution of all of these other outstanding complaints we have?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure you can resolve the nuclear issue. I think you can manage the nuclear issue. Because as I said, I think Iran's motivation to acquire a nuclear weapons capability is very deeply seated, and you know, may not be possible to persuade this particular regime to give it up. But I think that the U.S. regional strategy, which I mentioned earlier, of trying to contain Iran by strengthening an alliance with the Sunni Arab countries, that does have some beneficial effect on the nuclear issue. I think the Iranians are very sensitive to the risk of being isolated in the region, and so to some extent they, might be prepared to moderate their behavior on some of these other issues in order to, avoid, or in order to try to break up what they see as U.S. efforts to form an alliance against them. For example, I think it's quite, Lebanon is an interesting sort of, proxy battleground for a lot of different countries, unfortunately for Lebanon. But it is quite interesting that so far Hezbollah, which of course is closely allied with Iran, has been avoiding an open confrontation with the government. And I think whether or not a compromise candidate can be reached for presidency will be kind of a bellwether for broader issues in the region, and this kind of shadowy conflict of influence between the Sunni Arabs and the Shia Persians.
Yes, my name's Stephen Morris. I'm with Johns Hopkins SAIS. Talk about bombing the nuclear facilities in Iran has led to a response from the Iranians that if the United States bombs their nuclear facilities, they'll retaliate by bombing Israel, and obviously they're going to hit civilian centers and cause huge civilian casualties. My question, a few weeks ago, a man who's now turned out to be extremely unreliable, named Mr. Debat, claimed that there was a Pentagon plan to bomb all of their conventional weapons capabilities as well, to take out their armed forces. Leaving aside the dubious Mr. Debat, my question to you is that possible for the United States to take out the the conventional weapons capability of Iran at the same time as they attack the nuclear facilities, thereby avoiding the annihilation of hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians? And secondly, my second question is, if the Iranians get a nuclear capability, how quickly would they be able to develop a portability weapons system which could be then transferred to Hezbollah or other terrorist organizations based in Syria to take operations either in the region or in Europe? We know that Hezbollah takes operations on behalf of Iran all over the world. The case of Argentina in 1992 and 1994, where they blew up the Israeli embassy, and then later the Israeli Cultural Center, the Jewish Cultural Center, I should say, killing 100 civilians. This was an Iranian operation through Hezbollah. Now, with nuclear weapons, this could be devastating, portable. And so my question to you is, how quickly could they ever develop, once they develop a capability, how quickly could they develop a portability capability which would be useful by Hezbollah?
Well, let me try to address those questions. First, on the military plans, of course, I haven't seen the military plans, but I assume there's a big package and a small package, and the small package is, just to destroy the handful of key nuclear facilities, and presumably there's a bigger package which would destroy not only that, but command and control, missile production sites, missile deployment sites, naval facilities, and so forth. Obviously, that would entail a much longer campaign, much greater, resources being involved. I don't think the United States is capable of eliminating all of Iran's conventional weapons, obviously, but I think the U.S. would probably be able to significantly damage Iran's ability to reach Israel with conventional weapons, that is to say missiles or aircraft, of which the Iranians have a pretty limited inventory. But, I think one of the interesting questions, and we don't know the answer to this, is how would the Iranians retaliate? They say that they would, cause a regional war, but I think most experts feel that the Iranian response would likely be much more measured because they don't want to invite escalation. And as a consequence, they're not likely to, attack shipping in the Persian Gulf or, drop bombs on Saudi oil fields or shoot missiles at Israel. Now, that wouldn't stop the price of oil from going up to $200 a barrel, and that would be a pretty stiff economic consequence of any attack. But most people say, and certainly the Iranian officials I've asked have said to me, that they would retaliate through indirect means, through Afghanistan, through Iraq, through Hezbollah against targets in Israel. Now, of course, that wouldn't necessarily prevent escalation because we would catch them doing that and we would retaliate and you could get into a quid pro quo. But I think it's unlikely that the immediate Iranian response would be some massive escalation. I just don't think they want to get into a full-scale war with the United States. Now, you asked a very important question about transfer to terrorists. I think this is really a key issue because if you believe that a nuclear-armed Iran is likely to give nuclear weapons to terrorists, then I think the argument for using military force becomes overwhelming. But if you think that they will act rationally and cautiously, and they wouldn't want to provide nuclear weapons to terrorists because of the danger that would lead to massive retaliation against Iran, then there's a much stronger argument for saying that, as unpleasant as it is, you could probably deter and contain. And I think that's a really important question because we don't know the answer to that question. But I saw a poll the other day which was really interesting. It had like 78% of Americans thought that Iran would give nuclear weapons to terrorists. And the number in Europe was much smaller. I can't remember the numbers now. It was less than 50%. I think that's one of the reasons why there are different perceptions in America and Europe about the kind of threat that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose. But to answer your technical question, I mean, once they had a nuclear weapon, they could transfer it right away if they made the political decision to do so. The question is whether they would take such a risk.
I notice you didn't tell us if you were in that 78% or not.
I don't think they would. I mean, following from what I said earlier about the Iranians being deterred by the threat of massive retaliation, I think anybody knows that if they provided weapons to terrorists, if the terrorists used those weapons, there would be a risk that it would be traced back to them and that they would suffer accordingly. So I think it's unlikely.
It's only a risk to be traced back. That's an important question. Can they transfer weapons? Can those weapons be used?
Yes, of course.
Without the origins being known?
Well, that's a very, very good question. It gets into a lot of technical issues about our ability. It's called this whole question of forensics. I think we'd have a pretty good ability to trace the origin of the material. Now, we wouldn't know how the material got into the hands of the terrorists. I mean, if a bomb blew up tomorrow in New York City and we were able to say that, oh, this material was produced in Russia, we wouldn't know how the terrorists got their hands on it. And the same thing would be true if you were able to identify the material as North Korea origin or, from Iran. But yes, I think that we have a pretty strong technical capability. Not perfect, but pretty strong.
Thank you. I'm Carol Wasser, an interested and maybe naive citizen. I'm interested, sir, in your view, what you see as the American hegemony in the Middle East, as threatened by Iran. We're there. We have our interests. We've made a whale of a mess in Iraq. We talk about invading Iran, Isfahan, Natanz, which would take out a lot of people, irreplaceable cultural and historical sites. Reference was made to the poor Israelis who might be attacked, but I don't hear, and I don't hear any talk about the consequences of attacking. The Iranians made the grand bargain proposal in 2003. I understand that there have been a lot of offers to negotiate. The Iraq study group says that the regional neighbors should be involved in our solving the problem in Iraq. I'd like you to comment on, those are the concerns I have. Our first response as a nation is war, is violence. And we're showing ourselves in Iraq that maybe that isn't such a hot thing, and maybe we ought to do what we can to work with these people. We were in Iran, and I guarantee you that if we attack Iran, those people are going to be unified behind a government that they're not unified behind now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I share your concern about the consequences of a military attack. And I'm not a big fan of the Bush administration, but I do think the Bush administration genuinely hopes to avoid facing that decision of whether or not to use military force.
Vice President Cheney as well?
I can't speak for Vice President Cheney. I think Vice President Cheney is probably skeptical that the diplomacy will be successful. I share that skepticism. And the Bush administration has made an offer to negotiate with Iran on condition of suspension. The Iranians have said, we'll be happy to negotiate with you, but we won't suspend. So, this is an issue of whether or not you think the condition of suspension is a sensible demand. I think it is. It's supported by the UN Security Council, so it's not a unilateral American position. It's a position of the international community, to the extent that the UN Security Council represents the international community. I don't think the U.S. is blameless in all of this. I think we did miss an opportunity back in 2003 when the Iranians felt weak and where we were in a much better position to negotiate a deal that would have been acceptable to us, and I think the Bush administration missed that opportunity. But right now, the problem is not the United States. Right now, the problem is Iran. They don't want a deal. They want a nuclear weapons capability, and they think they can get away with it.
The guy right next to you.
Thank you. Faribors Fatemi, Oxfordshire Group. I want to follow up her question because I think it's a very important question in terms of diplomacy. You spoke about diplomatic stalemate. Have I missed something in the last 6 years? Where's the diplomacy? You say, we say to Iran, yes, go ahead. We'll sit with you as long as you stop the enrichment. Shouldn't be the discussion, let's sit down and talk, and part of that would be the question of enrichment? What if Iran says to us, all right, we'll negotiate, get out of Iraq? That's laughable. That's not a negotiation. It is a precondition to a negotiation. So tell me about diplomacy. What diplomacy, and why haven't we tried it?
Well, I think, diplomacy always involves conditionality. And so the issue is whether or not it is an achievable or sensible condition to demand suspension as a basis for beginning direct negotiations over the nuclear issue. And, the UN Security Council thinks that it is. Now, the Iranians disagree. The Iranians argue that if we suspend our program and sit down and talk, you Americans will just drag out the talks, for years and years, and we'll be forced to, suspend our program during that time, and we will lose the opportunity to, move ahead with our technology. I can understand why they're worried about that. And I think the counter-response, which Javier Solana tried to work out with Ali Larijani, was a temporary suspension. Let's both sides suspend their aggressive activities. The UN Security Council would suspend its sanctions, and Iran would suspend its enrichment program, and let's take 6 months and see if we can't try to figure out some way to resolve this problem. This is the so-called double timeout. Now, what Solana, I mean, my understanding is that Solana thought that Larijani would go for this deal, that this kind of double timeout would be a fair approach. You know, both sides would be, you know, stopping certain activities as a condition for getting to the table. So there would be reciprocity and there would be equality in it. Well, you know, Larijani's position was overruled by his, you know, by his government back in Tehran. So, you know, I think diplomacy requires diplomacy from both sides. And I think the Iranians, in my view, the Iranians have not shown particular interest in engaging in diplomacy if the price is to suspend their enrichment program.
Thank you. Josephine Fransen from the Netherlands Embassy. I had a question about Iranian confidence at the moment. It's very high. We've seen it in a number of occasions. Lately in New York with
Yes.
President Ahmadinejad.
Yes.
I was wondering whether you could say what you believe could take down a bit of that level of confidence, and would, for instance, a strengthening of or new sanctions from the EU, would that help?
I think it would help. I mean, it can't hurt. I mean, I think the problem with the EU-only sanctions is that, as I said, because they can be circumvented by other countries, I think the impact they'll have on Tehran is somewhat limited. But nonetheless, I think, you know, those elements of the Iranian ruling class that, you know, have both business and political interests and good ties with Europe, they will be dissatisfied. And the theory here, again, is that those groups will lobby, you know, the supreme leader and argue that, you know, that their economic interests and their interests in going to The Hague for their summer holidays are, you know, being jeopardized, and that this confrontation has to be avoided. So I think it's worth doing. I'm skeptical that coalition of the willing sanctions by themselves can have the same impact as UN Security Council sanctions, but since we're not going to have any more UN Security Council sanctions for the rest of this year, I think we better make do with EU sanction. And I'm very interested in the internal dynamics in the EU, which I don't fully understand. They're always very opaque to an American. But, you know, obviously you've had a very significant shift in the French position, and the British, I think, are also there, but, you know, there are questions about some of the other key players, Germany and Spain and Italy, and I don't know where the Netherlands is, but I'd be very interested to see how that plays out in the next couple months.
Ed Berger, let me address the issue of suspension. Discussions of suspension, as I understand it, in every case urge suspension to zero. The signatory to the NPT, as I understand it, is in fact permitted to enrich uranium to some levels. If that's true, why does our discussion always turn around the issue of suspension to zero? And why doesn't their argument, whether it's true or false, of desiring enriched uranium for power purposes, why shouldn't we let them continue with that argument to our benefit?
Right. Well, suspension simply means to stop operating the facilities. So if the Iranians were to suspend tomorrow, they would turn off the centrifuge machines and they would stop producing UF6. That's all suspension means. Suspension is not dismantlement or disablement. It's simply a standstill. And the same with sanctions. The offer on the table is that the sanctions would not be lifted, but they would be suspended, that all of the restrictions on movement and capital and so forth would be suspended. So, you know, as I say, it's a double timeout. It's a stand down by both sides, is maybe a better way to put it. Now, you know, on your question about the NPT, I don't want to get into too much of this because some of it's law and some of it's theology. But, you know, yes, a country in the NPT is permitted to develop a civilian enrichment program for peaceful purposes. That's not what Iran's program is. Iran's program is to develop a civilian enrichment program for a nuclear weapons option. And that view is a consensus view of, you know, every, you know, official that I know of. Even the Iranians say it. Even the Iranians say that the program is intended to develop a nuclear weapons option.
Yes, my name is Kunio Kikuchi from Masaoka Associates, and I'm Japanese, so I'm fascinated at this discussion and focusing on what kind of a threat Iran might be. But Well, your last point, and throughout this talk, you said that Iran unequivocally is trying to develop weapons, and if I heard Mr. Ahmadinejad correctly at Columbia University and in other locations, he vehemently denied that Iran has any intentions of going the nuclear way because it doesn't add anything to their security. So, but assuming that, you know, your premise that he is lying through his teeth is correct, I still think that Iran doesn't add anything with a nuclear weapon, because today, even without the nuclear weapon, there's a lot of hesitation about attacking Iran. So what does it do? You know, that's the whole point. I think we are actually in a bigger game in which higher tensions, prolonged state of uncertainty is the end game, so that the budget expenditures could be maintained. Thank you.
Well, I've had this discussion with Iranians many times, and I've, made the case that having nuclear weapons would not be in Iran's interest because it would spur further proliferation and, risk regional instability and even risk nuclear war, which obviously is not in Tehran's interest. And the answer you get back from the Iranians is, I completely agree with you. That's why you can trust us never to use our civil enrichment program for nuclear weapons. They're very, very sophisticated and clever people. And they are extraordinarily good diplomats. But, I have to say that that their claim that the program is purely peaceful is simply not believed. And when you talk to Iranians privately, as I said, they don't even claim that themselves. They make a more sophisticated argument, which is that, in fact, this was told to me by a very senior Iranian official in the last government when I was in Tehran. He said to me, "We have to be like Japan. We'll be parties to the NPT, but we need to have a latent nuclear weapons capability. We need to have the ability to produce fissile material. But just like Japan, we will, we will not build nuclear weapons." So the question is, do you believe that? I don't believe that. I believe that once they had over time, I'm not saying it would happen right away, but I'm saying that if they had the capability, the temptation or the pressure to eventually translate that into weapons would be overwhelming. They don't live they live in an area of incredible conflict and tension and war. Very different from the situation that Japan lives in. And Japan, of course, has the benefit of the U.S. security relationship, so it provides an alternative to Japan having its own deterrent. Nobody's protecting Iran. And this is something you hear from the Iranians over and over again, that when they were attacked, blatantly invaded by Iraq, nobody came to their defense, that they can only count on themselves to protect themselves. And I just think, given their history, given their sort of sense of themselves as being a great power that needs the prestige of nuclear weapons, given the nature of the region they're in and the security threats they face, I just cannot believe that it's extraordinarily likely that they would build nuclear weapons if they had the opportunity.
Last question in the back.
My name is Roya Soleimani, and I'm a concerned citizen and an Iranian American who's concerned both about the security of the United States and the security of the people of Iran. And a previous question was regarding the domestic policies in Iran, and I'd like to know what your opinion is on the elevation that Ahmadinejad has received as being involved in the foreign relations of Iran, when really the power of that is really in the hands of the supreme leader of Iran when looking at the institutions of Iran's theocratic government. So how does that elevation of his, essentially, his reach affect our policy with Iran? And furthermore, how does that weaken the democratic institutions and the reform movement in Iran and the human rights issues that are being overlooked because Iranians are nationalists and they're rallying around the flag even though they don't have faith in their own government? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I don't think I really can understand Iranian domestic politics, and I'm always very suspicious of anybody who claims to actually know what's going on, because it's an incredibly complicated and opaque system. And as you say correctly, the power structure is nothing like our power structure. And President Ahmadinejad is not like President Bush or President Putin. I mean, in terms of his power and authority within the government. What most people say is that, you know, President Ahmadinejad was created by the supreme leader in order to balance the power of Rafsanjani. And, you know, at the same time, some people say they see indications that the supreme leader is a little concerned about the power of Ahmadinejad, and so he's slightly elevated Rafsanjani, you know, to become head of the Council of Experts in order to keep these two, you know, competing powers in check. To me, that's kind of an attractive image of what Iranian politics is like, although I'm sure it's much, much more complicated than that. Now, you know, most people think that Ahmadinejad's role on the nuclear issue is pretty limited, that it's really the supreme leader who makes the final decision on these fundamental national security issues. And many people argue that the strategy that was pursued by the pragmatic conservatives in the immediate aftermath of the Iraq War, the kind of Rafsanjani strategy of negotiating with the Europeans, that they overpromised. They said to the supreme leader, look, let us negotiate a deal with the Europeans. We'll strike an agreement that's acceptable to us, that allows us to have a civilian enrichment program under various political and technical constraints. We'll isolate the United States. And that was what they promised the supreme leader. But that didn't happen. The Europeans you know, sided with the U.S. position of basically no or very long 10-year delay in the enrichment program. And so that undercut their credibility with the supreme leader. And he decided, in part because that previous strategy failed, in part because of the calculation that Iran was in a stronger position, to push ahead with this more aggressive approach of pursuing enrichment despite the UN Security Council and so forth. As I said earlier, one theory is that at some point, if the supreme leader thinks they've pushed it far enough to achieve a certain technical threshold, like a pilot scale facility, he might decide to throttle back. He might decide to take a little pause, to get through the Bush administration, to relieve some of the international pressure, go through the motions of negotiating for, you know, a year or 6 months, and then at some point in the future, start the program up again. I mean, that would be, I think, a typical tactic for the Iranians, because, as I say, they're very clever and sophisticated diplomacy, and I think generally try to avoid open confrontation if they can.
Well, that's great. We are sadly out of time. I mean, Gary's taken an hour of questions, and I'm really happy that we have more questions, but no time. So, thank you.